Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into one of the oldest human experiences in history. The strange and quiet moments when the world around you is asleep, but your own mind refuses to rest. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm journeys through forgotten parts of history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how many people around the world are relaxing together while exploring the past. Now, imagine yourself thousands of years ago. There are no glowing screens beside your bed. No clocks telling you how late it is. No music playing softly in the background. No modern medicine waiting nearby, just darkness, a small flame flickering in the corner, the quiet sounds of a sleeping village outside, and you are still awake. For most of human history, sleepless nights were a normal part of life. Ancient people experienced the same frustrating feeling that many of us know today, lying comfortably in bed, closing your eyes, and waiting for sleep that simply refuses to arrive. But what happened next? What did people do when the night felt endless? Some turned to strange remedies made from plants and oils. Some whispered prayers or performed quiet rituals. Some listened to stories until their minds became tired. Others believed that the darkness itself held mysteries that needed to be understood. In ancient Egypt, a sleepless person might search for comfort through familiar rituals, scents, and traditions passed down through generations. In ancient Rome, the wealthy might spend their late hours reading, bathing, talking with others, or enjoying the peaceful moments after the busy day had ended. In ancient Greece, a person awake in the night might turn their thoughts toward philosophy, dreams, and questions about life itself. And for ordinary farmers, workers, and families, sleepless nights were often spent beside a small fire, sharing stories, preparing for the next day, or simply waiting for morning light to return. Tonight, we are traveling through those forgotten hours, because insomnia is not modern, restlessness is not modern. The wandering mind that refuses to become quiet is something our ancestors knew very well, thousands of years ago. Beneath skies untouched by electric lights, countless people lay awake listening to familiar sounds. A shepherd somewhere in the hills of Greece heard distant sheep moving in the darkness. Along the Nile, an Egyptian mother listened to reeds rustling beside the riverbanks. Inside a Roman house, an old merchant stared at shadows dancing across painted walls while the embers in his lamp slowly faded. Far away, in villages that history never recorded, ordinary people turned over on straw mattresses and wondered why sleep had abandoned them. Perhaps they worried about tomorrow, perhaps they remembered someone they loved, or perhaps they simply experienced the strange mystery that every generation has known. The human mind is awake when it wishes to rest. Night itself felt different in the ancient world. Without bright cities and constant noise, darkness seemed larger, deeper, almost alive. People noticed things we rarely notice now: the crackling sound of dying firewood, the distant cry of owls, the soft wind touching wooden shutters, the breathing of family members sleeping nearby. And during those long silent hours, thoughts often became heavier, questions appeared, memories returned, fears seemed larger than they did beneath the sun. Yet there was also something strangely peaceful hidden inside those sleepless moments, because when the world grew quiet, people listened to stories, to prayers, to each other, and sometimes to themselves. Long before clocks measured the night, humanity had already learned that darkness held its own rhythm, and somewhere among those ancient shadows, people began creating quiet ways to make peace with the hours when sleep refused to come, ways that would carry us next to the banks of the Nile. And so, as the last thoughts of restless minds drifted across the ancient world, our journey carries us gently toward the banks of the Nile, where the river moved slowly beneath the moon, and where sleepless nights were wrapped in customs as old as memory itself. The world of ancient Egypt did not truly sleep. Even in the deepest hours of darkness, life whispered softly around the great river. Frogs sang among the reeds. Palm trees swayed in the cool breeze. Somewhere in the distance, water lapped against wooden boats tied to the shore, and inside homes built from sun-baked mud brick, many people lay awake just as we do today. To the Egyptians, night was not simply the absence of day. It was a sacred passage, a mysterious time when the visible world became quieter, and unseen things seemed closer. For someone struggling to sleep, comfort often began with familiar scents. Egyptians loved fragrances. They filled their lives with pleasant aromas, believing that sweet smells brought harmony to both body and spirit. Small jars of oils rested inside many homes. Lotus, lily, myrrh, and frankincense were treasured gifts from nature. A tired person might gently rub perfumed oils onto their hands or temples, allowing the comforting fragrance to drift through the room while the flame of a small lamp flickered nearby. These quiet moments were not hurried. Life itself moved more slowly. And perhaps that slower rhythm offered its own kind of peace. Some families whispered prayers before attempting to sleep again, not fearful prayers, but familiar ones, words repeated so many times that they became part of everyday life, like the sound of water flowing beside the Nile. People believed the gods watched over the hours of darkness. They hoped for protection, peaceful dreams, and safe passage through the strange world that sleep seemed to open. Nearby, tiny household shrines often stood against walls, holding simple figures and offerings, nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just quiet symbols of hope in uncertain hours. And while priests performed elaborate ceremonies inside magnificent temples, ordinary people had their own smaller traditions. A mother might softly hum to a restless child, an elderly grandfather might tell stories remembered from his own parents. Someone awake long after midnight could simply sit outside beneath the stars, listening to the sounds of the river and waiting patiently for tiredness to return. The Egyptians were patient people. After all, they lived according to the rhythm of seasons and floods. Not every problem demanded immediate solutions. Sometimes, waiting itself was enough. The moon held special beauty for them. Its pale light transformed familiar landscapes into something gentle and dreamlike. White walls glowed softly, date palms became dark silhouettes, and the mighty Nile reflected the stars as though heaven itself had descended into the water. For a sleepless farmer or craftsman, these moments carried strange kinds of thoughts. Memories of loved ones, concerns about the coming harvest, questions about dreams, or perhaps simple wonder, because the Egyptians viewed the universe as a place filled with balance, order and chaos, light and darkness, day and night. Neither side could exist without the other, and maybe sleeplessness itself was simply another quiet thread woven into that balance. There were also beliefs that dreams carried messages. Not every dream, of course, but some. People paid attention to symbols and strange visions, treating them with curiosity rather than fear, which meant that lying awake between sleeping and dreaming felt almost sacred. A doorway, not fully one world, and not fully another, and perhaps because of this, Egyptians rarely thought of the night as wasted. Darkness had meaning, silence had meaning, even wakefulness had meaning. Outside, the stars slowly turned above monuments that already seemed eternal. The pyramids rested beneath moonlight. Temple columns stood motionless in the cool air, and somewhere beside the endless Nile, a tired soul finally closed their eyes. Not because sleep had been forced, but because it had arrived quietly, like the river itself. Yet beyond Egypt, across the waters of the Mediterranean and through countless lands connected by trade and travel, people searched for comfort in very different ways. Some trusted herbs, some drank unusual mixtures, and some remedies would seem rather strange to us today. And as the Nile slowly disappeared behind us, carried away by the gentle currents of memory, the ancient night continued to unfold, for although many people accepted sleeplessness with patience, others spent centuries searching for something more, something that might coax tired eyes to close, something that might invite dreams to return. And across the ancient world, from Egypt to Greece, from Mesopotamia to distant lands beyond the Mediterranean, countless remedies emerged from observation, tradition, and quiet hope. Some were soothing, some were curious, and a few seem rather mysterious even now. Long before pharmacies and sleeping tablets, people turned to the natural world. After all, plants had always been companions to humanity. Their scents, flavors, and hidden properties were woven into everyday life. A sleepless person might prepare a warm drink made from herbs gathered earlier in the day, not because they understood chemicals or modern medicine, but because generations before them had whispered the same advice: drink this, it helped your grandmother, it helped her mother before that. And so traditions traveled through families like old stories. Poppy flowers were known in some regions for their calming qualities. Mandrake roots, wrapped in mystery and superstition, fascinated healers and storytellers alike. Certain leaves were crushed into mixtures. Others were steeped in water. No two villages agreed completely. Every land seemed to possess its own quiet secrets. Ancient Egyptians favored fragrant oils and sweet-smelling resins. The Greeks experimented with herbs and simple remedies passed between physicians and neighbors. In Mesopotamia, healers sometimes combined natural treatments with spoken prayers, believing that both body and spirit deserved equal care. For them, sleep was never just physical, it was something deeper, something connected to harmony itself, and perhaps that belief brought comfort. Even when remedies failed, there were unusual ideas as well. Some people believed certain stones held peaceful energies. Others thought that sleeping near particular plants might encourage pleasant dreams. Bundles of dried herbs were placed beside beds. Perfumes were burned slowly in small containers, allowing gentle smoke to drift upward toward wooden ceilings, not to overwhelm the senses, but to create calm. Even the act itself carried meaning. Preparing these remedies gave restless minds something to focus on, something slow, something familiar, and sometimes familiarity is comforting enough. There were warm baths scented with oils, soft cushions stuffed with dried flowers, light meals before bed instead of heavy feasts, quiet walks beneath moonlight. Many of these practices sound surprisingly familiar, because despite thousands of years separating us, human beings have always searched for peace in similar ways. Yet not every remedy came from careful wisdom. Some emerged from strange misunderstandings. Ancient physicians occasionally suggested unusual combinations that modern people might find puzzling: rare animal ingredients, curious powders, odd recipes copied from texts that themselves were based on much older traditions. And still, people trusted them, not because they were foolish, but because uncertainty has always inspired hope. When sleep disappears, hope becomes precious. Even today, people try countless solutions: different pillows, special teas, calming music. Ancient people were no different. They simply worked with the world they knew, and perhaps there was something comforting in that simplicity. No glowing numbers on bedside clocks, no endless worrying about how many hours remained before morning, just a person at a small flame, a cup of something warm, and the quiet belief that eventually, somehow, rest would come. But remedies alone could not explain everything, because to ancient minds, darkness itself felt different. Night carried mysteries that daylight could never fully reveal. Strange sounds seemed louder, shadows seemed deeper. And beyond the circle of firelight, many believed unseen forces moved through the world. Some spoke of wandering spirits, others whispered about protective gods, and as the stars wheeled overhead and the last embers faded into darkness, people began asking a different question. Perhaps sleeplessness was not merely something happening inside the body, perhaps it belonged to the night itself, and that ancient mystery would shape the beliefs of countless civilizations that followed. And so, as the scent of herbs faded and the last glowing embers of ancient remedies slowly dimmed, another thought began to emerge from the darkness. Perhaps the night itself was not the same as the day. Perhaps something changed when the sun disappeared. For most people living thousands of years ago, darkness was not simply a time shown on a clock, it was a transformation, a crossing from one world into another. And once the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, familiar places suddenly felt different. Fields that had seemed harmless beneath the afternoon sun became quiet oceans of shadow, roads disappeared into blackness, the sounds of ordinary life faded away. And in that silence, the imagination awakened. Ancient people lived in a world untouched by electric light. Their nights belonged to the moon, the stars, and the small circles of warmth created by oil lamps and fire. Beyond those tiny islands of light, mystery waited, and mystery has always had a powerful effect upon the human mind. In ancient Egypt, the journey of the sun did not end at sunset. People believed that each night, the sun god Ra traveled through the underworld, battling dangerous forces before returning triumphantly at dawn. To wake up in the morning was not merely routine, it was proof that order had once again overcome chaos. In Mesopotamia, darkness carried its own uncertainties. People spoke quietly about unseen spirits and strange visitors who moved through the hours before sunrise. Protective charms hung near doorways, small amulets rested beneath pillows, not because people spent every night in fear, but because caution brought comfort. Meanwhile, in Greece, stories filled the darkness. The gods themselves seemed close during the quiet hours. Dreams were thought to carry messages. The moon inspired poets, and strange sounds in the distance often became woven into myths that survived for centuries. Even ordinary noises took on new meaning after sunset. The cry of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the distant barking of dogs. A shifting breeze against wooden shutters. Without modern distractions, people noticed everything, and sometimes, what they noticed made them wonder. Children listened carefully to stories told by grandparents, stories of creatures no one had seen. Yet everyone somehow knew. Travelers shared tales gathered from distant lands, sailors spoke of strange lights on the sea, farmers described unusual sounds carried across empty fields. With each retelling, mystery became part of everyday life, and perhaps that mystery made sleepless nights feel even longer. Because when the world becomes quiet, thoughts become louder, a shadow on the wall becomes a question. An unfamiliar sound becomes a possibility, a restless mind begins creating stories of its own. Yet there was beauty hidden inside these ancient fears. People looked upward, far more often than we do today. The stars were not hidden by city lights, they stretched endlessly across the heavens. Bright and overwhelming, entire civilizations built stories around them. Constellations became heroes, planets became gods, and the moon itself seemed almost alive. For someone unable to sleep, stepping outside at night could feel strangely comforting. The cool air, the scent of earth, the distant songs of insects. The endless sky above, even loneliness seemed smaller beneath the stars. Because ancient people rarely saw themselves as separate from the universe, they belonged to it, and the night belonged to them. Perhaps that is why darkness inspired both fear and wonder. it reminded humanity that there were still mysteries beyond understanding, things that could not be measured, questions without answers, and somewhere between those questions, stories were born. Stories whispered beside fires, stories shared among families, stories passed from one generation to another, because when sleep refused to come, words often remained, and in countless homes across the ancient world. While the wind moved softly through the darkness and the stars turned overhead, people found comfort in voices, not the voices of gods, not the voices of spirits, but the familiar voices of one another, and before long, those quiet voices would become one of humanity's oldest companions during sleepless nights, the stories people chose to tell. And so, while stories drifted softly through the darkness and the stars continued their endless journey overhead, our path slowly leaves the older kingdoms behind. Across the Mediterranean Sea, another world waits, a world of marble columns and quiet courtyards, of flickering lamps and distant fountains, a world where sleepless nights visited rich and poor alike. Ancient Rome. By day, Rome was rarely silent. Merchants called out in crowded markets. Horses clattered over stone roads. Voices echoed between towering buildings, but when evening arrived and much of the city surrendered to sleep, another side of Roman life emerged, one far quieter, one that many restless souls came to appreciate. For the Romans, the hours after sunset were often seen as a chance to slow down, especially among the wealthy, whose evenings unfolded with patience rather than haste. A sleepless Roman might begin with something simple, a bath, not merely for cleanliness, but for peace. Warm water had long been associated with comfort, and many believed that bathing relaxed both body and mind. Inside private homes or public bathhouses, steam drifted through the air. Oil lamps cast gentle reflections on polished stone. Voices became hushed, and for a little while, the worries of the day seemed to soften. Afterward, fragrant oils were often applied to the skin, nothing extravagant by Roman standards. Just familiar scents that brought a sense of ease: lavender, rose, olive oil mixed with herbs, small comforts, quiet comforts. Some Romans preferred conversation, not lively debates or noisy celebrations, but slow conversations shared beneath moonlit courtyards. Friends sat together near fountains. Family members exchanged stories, servants finished their duties and settled into peaceful corners of the household. The city itself seemed to breathe more gently. For others, books became companions. By the light of a single lamp, educated Romans read poetry, philosophy, or letters from distant friends. Scrolls rested carefully upon wooden tables. The scratching sound of a stylus occasionally interrupted the silence. And while much of the world slept, thoughts wandered peacefully through words written long ago. Perhaps this sounds familiar, because even now, many people reach for books when sleep feels distant. Human habits have changed less than we sometimes imagine. There were those who simply walked. The wealthy often had gardens hidden behind their homes, small spaces filled with flowers, statues, and quiet pools of water. Under the pale glow of the moon, they wandered slowly through these peaceful places, listening, thinking, waiting. No clocks urged them forward. No glowing screens demanded attention, only the sound of crickets and the soft movement of leaves in the night breeze. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans had simpler evenings. Their homes were smaller, their beds less comfortable, yet they too found ways to endure restless hours. Some repaired tools for the next day, some sat beside fading fires. Others watched the stars through open windows and waited for exhaustion to arrive naturally. And sometimes, they simply accepted wakefulness. Roman writers occasionally mentioned sleepless nights without panic, as though such experiences belonged to life itself. Not every night would be perfect, not every mind would rest easily, and perhaps there was wisdom hidden in that understanding. Because the Romans, despite all their engineering and ambition, knew that some things could not be commanded, not fortune, not love, and certainly not sleep, outside, the streets grew quieter, the great city rested beneath the same stars that had watched over Egypt and Greece, temple roofs gleamed beneath moonlight, fountains continued their endless songs, and somewhere in a modest home or a luxurious villa, another restless soul waited patiently for dreams. But beyond Rome, across the seas and among the olive groves of Greece, people approached sleepless nights in a very different way, for the Greeks believed that wakefulness could become something unexpected, not a burden, but an opportunity, a time for reflection, a time for questions, and sometimes a time for philosophy itself. And so, as the fountains of Rome continued their quiet songs beneath the moonlight, our journey drifts eastward once more, across calm waters, past rocky shores and scattered islands, toward a land where sleepless nights were not always considered an enemy, for in ancient Greece, many believed that the hours between wakefulness and dreams possessed a special kind of stillness, a stillness in which the mind could wander freely. And perhaps nowhere did the night feel more thoughtful than beneath the gentle skies of Greece. Long after sunset, the world softened, the heat of the day slowly faded, cool breezes drifted through olive trees, the scent of wild herbs lingered in the air. And beneath endless stars, villages and cities settled into quiet rhythms. Inside modest homes, oil lamps burned softly, families prepared themselves for rest, simple meals had already been shared, bread, olives, figs, and watered wine had filled empty stomachs, children had grown sleepy, and one by one, familiar voices disappeared into silence, yet not everyone slept immediately, some remained awake, not with frustration, but with patience, for the Greeks understood something that many modern people have forgotten. The mind itself enjoys wandering, and sometimes, the hours before sleep became moments of reflection rather than resistance. A fisherman might sit outside his home, listening to the waves breaking gently against distant rocks. A shepherd returning from the hills might gaze upward at the stars and think quietly about the coming seasons. An old woman spinning wool by lamplight might remember stories from her childhood, allowing memories to drift through her thoughts like passing clouds. There was no urgency, no need to force sleep, only the slow passage of the night. Among philosophers, these peaceful hours held special meaning. The great thinkers of Greece often valued calm contemplation. Questions about life, happiness, friendship, and the nature of the universe filled their conversations. And while not everyone spent sleepless nights pondering profound mysteries, ordinary people also found comfort in thoughtful silence, because reflection belonged to everyone, not just scholars, not just poets. The stars above inspired endless wonder. Constellations moved slowly across the heavens, the moon painted silver paths across the sea, and beneath that vast sky, human worries sometimes felt smaller. Many Greeks believed that balance was essential. Too much work disturbed the spirit, too much worry disturbed the mind, even pleasure itself required moderation. Perhaps that belief shaped the way they approached restless nights. Instead of fighting wakefulness, they often accepted it as part of life's natural rhythm. There were quiet customs as well. Some people played soft melodies on simple instruments, others recited poems they had learned long ago. A father might tell his children stories about heroes and distant voyages before the household finally surrendered to sleep. Words carried comfort, not because they solved problems, but because they filled the darkness with familiarity. And outside, nature never truly slept. Cicadas sang in the warm air, owls called from ancient trees, gentle winds rustled through olive branches, the sea itself seemed to breathe. These sounds became companions to the sleepless, a reminder that they were not alone. Perhaps this was why the Greeks valued dreams so deeply. For dreams and thoughts seemed connected, one slowly flowing into the other, and somewhere between memory and imagination, many found peace, not through remedies, not through rituals, but through quiet acceptance, through listening, through wondering, and through allowing the night to unfold in its own time, because they knew something simple: sleep could not be chased, it arrived when it wished, and while waiting, there was no shame in sitting beneath the stars and allowing the mind to wander. Yet as comforting as thoughts could be, human beings have always longed for something even older, something shared beside countless fires, something passed from one voice to another, because when sleep refused to come, stories remained, and throughout the ancient world, those stories became faithful companions during the longest nights. And so, beneath the olive trees of Greece and the marble shadows of distant cities, the night deepens once more. The wind moves gently through ancient lands, carrying whispers of voices long gone, voices that once filled the darkness when sleep refused to arrive, because in the ancient world, storytelling was not just entertainment, it was comfort, it was warmth, it was a bridge between wakefulness and rest. When the world grew quiet, and the oil lamps burned low, people gathered in small circles of light, families, travelers, farmers returning late from the fields, even children too restless to close their eyes. They all shared the same simple need, to feel less alone in the dark. And so stories began, not written at first, but spoken, slowly, softly, carried by memory rather than ink. Some stories were ancient even to those telling them. Tales of heroes who wandered through impossible lands, of journeys across endless seas, of gods who shaped fate with unseen hands, of lovers separated by distance and time, of kings who learned wisdom only after great loss. Each story held a rhythm, a steady pulse, like footsteps fading into sand, and as the voice of the storyteller moved through each sentence, something subtle began to happen. The listener's breathing slowed, their thoughts softened, the sharp edges of the day began to blur, not because the stories were magical, but because they were familiar. Human minds have always responded to narrative. Long before writing existed, stories were how people made sense of the world. They explained storms, they explained dreams, they explained fear itself. In Mesopotamia, stories spoke of vast rivers and divine struggles. In Egypt, they carried echoes of the sun's journey through the underworld. In Greece, they followed heroes who wrestled with fate and destiny. And in every culture, the purpose was the same: to give shape to the unknown. To make the night feel less empty, a tired farmer might hear a tale of a wandering traveler who found shelter just before a storm. A child might listen wide-eyed to stories of animals that spoke beneath the moonlight. An old merchant might recall legends from distant cities he once visited, letting memory blur into imagination, and slowly, the boundary between story and sleep would begin to fade, because stories do something gentle to the mind. They guide it away from worry, away from time, away from the quiet pressure of wakefulness. They offer a place where thoughts can drift without resistance. Even the structure of storytelling itself mirrored rest. A beginning, a middle, an ending, a sense of completion, something the restless mind often craves but cannot find on its own. And so, as voices continued through the night, something almost invisible passed from one person to another. A shared calm, a shared stillness, not enforced, not demanded, but offered. Outside, the world remained vast and unknowable. Stars moved slowly above rooftops and rivers. Shadows stretched across empty paths. The wind carried the scent of earth and stone. But inside those small circles of light, everything felt closer, warmer, safer, and eventually, as stories softened into murmurs, Even the storyteller began to slow, words grew longer between pauses, sentences loosened their shape, until finally, there was silence again, but it was not an empty silence, it was a full one, a silence filled with understanding, with presence, with the quiet after a shared journey, and in that silence, sleep often arrived unnoticed, not as an event, but as a gentle fading, like the last note of a distant melody, disappearing into the night air. Yet even as stories ended, life did not pause, because beyond the warmth of shared voices, there were always those who remained awake for other reasons, not for comfort, not for reflection, but because the world itself required them to stay in motion while others slept, and in those quiet hours, when most eyes were closed, work continued, silently, patiently, under the same stars that watched over every storyteller, every listener, and every dreamer. And so, as the last echoes of ancient stories fade into the stillness of the night, we drift away from heroes and legends, and return to something quieter, something closer, the lives of ordinary people, because beyond temples, beyond palaces, beyond the voices of storytellers, most sleepless nights in the ancient world belonged to simple households, homes made of clay, stone, wood, and woven reeds. Places where life was not recorded in history books, but lived gently in repetition. Here, night did not feel like a grand mystery, it felt familiar, predictable, almost comforting in its rhythm. When sleep refused to come, people did not always seek answers, they followed small, quiet habits instead. A woman might straighten the corner of a woven mat, even though it was already neat. A man might quietly adjust the position of a clay lamp, watching the flame flicker slightly as oil shifted within it. A child might lie awake listening to the soft breathing of family members nearby, counting those breaths without realizing it. These were not rituals in the formal sense, they were habits born from life itself, and yet, they carried a strange power, because repetition soothes the mind. In ancient Egypt, a sleepless person might sit near the doorway of their home, feeling the cool night air move across their skin. In Mesopotamia, someone might trace patterns in the dust on a floor, letting thought slow with each movement. In Greece, a person might quietly observe the shifting shadows on a wall, noticing how light changed shape with every passing minute. And in Rome, a restless citizen might simply walk through a dim corridor again and again, letting footsteps replace racing thoughts. No urgency, no expectation, only movement through stillness. Even the simplest actions became anchors. Pouring a small cup of water, rearranging a blanket, listening to the wind outside. These moments did not promise sleep, but they made wakefulness easier to carry. There was also something deeply human in how people responded to the quiet hours. Without distraction, the mind often turned inward. Memories appeared gently, without warning, faces of loved ones, places once visited, conversations long forgotten, not always heavy, not always joyful, just present, and in that presence, the night softened. Many households also shared a silent understanding. If someone was awake, they were not alone. A parent might stay nearby without speaking, a sibling might shift slightly in sleep, aware without fully waking. Even in silence, there was connection, and connection made the darkness less sharp. Outside, ancient worlds moved slowly. The sound of distant animals occasionally broke the stillness. Wind moved through narrow streets. Stars continued their patient journey across the sky. Time itself felt wider at night, less divided, less measured, and in that space, ordinary people learned something without ever naming it. That sleeplessness does not always need to be fought. Sometimes it can simply be lived through, gently, quietly, like a river passing through familiar land. There were no instructions passed down from great philosophers for these moments, no grand teachings carved into stone. only lived experience, only patience learned through repetition of countless nights, and perhaps that is why these small habits endured for so long, because they required nothing more than being present, a hand resting on a clay wall, a breath slowing without effort, a gaze lost in the dim glow of a dying lamp, and slowly, very slowly, the body would begin to follow the calm that the mind could not yet find. Not always leading to sleep, but often leading to acceptance, and acceptance, in the ancient world, was sometimes the closest thing to rest. Yet even as ordinary people moved through their quiet rituals, there were others whose nights were far less still, people whose work demanded wakefulness while others dreamed, guardians, servants, watchers of cities and fields, and in their world, night was not a place of peace, but of responsibility. And so, as we leave behind the quiet simplicity of ordinary homes, the night begins to change its shape once again, not in sound, not in sky, but in the spaces where people lived, because in the ancient world, sleeplessness did not belong equally to everyone. The night felt different depending on where you stood, and for those born into wealth, darkness was not only something to endure, it was something that could be shaped. Inside grand Roman villas, marble floors remained cool even after long days of heat. Soft lamps burned in carefully designed rooms where light was never harsh, only gentle. Silk curtains moved slightly with the night breeze, and beyond open courtyards, fountains continued their quiet rhythm, as if time itself had slowed within the walls of luxury. A wealthy person lying awake did not face the same silence as a farmer in a distant field. Their world was filled with subtle comfort, soft textures, carefully arranged spaces, and attendants who moved almost silently through hallways, ensuring that everything remained calm. If sleep did not arrive, there were choices. A person might request a warm drink prepared in the kitchen below. Lightly sweetened, carefully measured, served in ceramic cups that retained warmth just long enough to be comforting. Others might call for reading materials, scrolls brought from private libraries, poetry, philosophy, letters from distant friends or political allies. Words became companions in the darkness, not urgent, not demanding, just present. In Egyptian elite households, fragrant oils and carefully prepared bathing rituals continued well into the night. A sleepless noble might sit in a private chamber while attendants gently applied scented oils to the skin. Lotus, cedar, and myrrh drifting through the air like soft reminders of distant gardens. In Greece, wealthy families sometimes extended their evenings with music. A harp played quietly in a courtyard, a flute carried soft notes through stone corridors. Nothing loud, nothing overwhelming, only sound meant to ease the mind rather than excite it. And in Rome, conversation itself became an art during the late hours. Guests gathered not for celebration, but for calm discussion. Philosophy, poetry, and memory filled the space where sleep had not yet arrived. Yet even among luxury, sleeplessness remained unchanged in its essence, because wealth could soften the environment, but it could not fully command the mind. A Roman senator might still lie awake thinking about decisions made that day. A merchant might replay conversations about trade and risk. A noblewoman might stare at painted ceilings, watching shadows shift slowly with oil lamplight, while thoughts wandered far beyond the room. No matter how refined the surroundings became, the human mind remained the same, and perhaps this was something even the wealthy quietly understood. That comfort reduces difficulty, but does not erase it. Still, there was a difference. Time moved more gently in these spaces. There was no pressure to rise early for labor, no urgency of survival pressing against the night. Instead, there was patience. A kind of waiting that felt almost ritualistic. Some wealthy individuals even embraced sleepless hours as part of their lifestyle. They used the quiet to think, to plan, to reflect on their position in the world, not always out of necessity, but sometimes out of habit, because when life is filled with abundance, even wakefulness becomes something to observe rather than fear. Outside these marble walls, however, the world continued differently. Cities were quieter now, but still alive with distant activity. Servants, guards, and workers moved through narrow streets, torches flickered along stone paths, and beyond city gates, roads stretched into darkness where travelers and laborers continued their journeys under open skies, a world divided by comfort, yet united by the same moon above, and in that shared night, something subtle remained true, whether resting on straw or silk, whether beneath a thatched roof or marble ceiling, sleep was never fully guaranteed. It arrived when it chose to arrive, not when wealth demanded it, not when effort insisted upon it. Just as it always had, and as the night deepened further, even the richest households grew quieter, lamps dimmed, voices faded, and slowly, the difference between luxury and simplicity dissolved into the same universal stillness, a stillness that would soon carry us beyond private rooms and into the wider world, where sleepless nights belonged not to comfort, but to duty. And so, as the villas fade into the distance and the soft glow of marble courtyards dissolves into the wider night, we arrive at a quieter place in this journey, a place where history stops feeling familiar for a moment, because beyond the well-known stories of rituals, philosophers, and wealthy households, there were habits so subtle, so ordinary, and sometimes so unexpected, that they were almost never recorded at all, and yet, they shaped how people experienced the long hours of sleeplessness across ancient civilizations. In many parts of the ancient world, sleep was not treated as a single uninterrupted block of time. Instead, people often moved through the night in phases. They would sleep, wake, and sleep again, not because they planned it, but because their bodies naturally followed the rhythm of darkness. A farmer in a quiet village might wake in the middle of the night and simply remain still for a while, listening to the wind moving through fields. A mother might briefly wake to check on her children before lying back down without concern. A traveler might pause under the open sky, noticing how the stars had shifted without realizing how much time had passed. These small awakenings were not considered strange, they were part of life, and in that acceptance, there was a calm we rarely experience today. Another surprising habit involved light itself. People were extremely careful with fire at night, because light was precious. It was never wasted. A single oil lamp might be adjusted repeatedly to control its flame. Too bright, and it disturbed rest. Too dim, and it disappeared into darkness. So people learned to live within a soft middle space, a gentle glow that shaped their entire perception of night. In some regions, people even preferred partial darkness over full light. Because darkness was not always feared, sometimes it was trusted. It allowed the eyes to rest, the mind to slow, and thoughts to become less sharp. There were also habits connected to sound. In ancient homes, silence was never completely silent. The subtle noises of life were always present, wood shifting as temperatures changed, water slowly dripping from containers, the faint movement of animals nearby. Instead of resisting these sounds, many people grew used to them. They became part of the background of existence, and for someone unable to sleep, these sounds were not interruptions, but companions. Another surprising detail comes from how people treated time at night. Without clocks glowing on walls or phones lighting up rooms, time became fluid. A sleepless person might have no idea whether an hour or 3 had passed. And strangely, this lack of measurement often reduced anxiety, because there was nothing to track, nothing to compare, only the steady presence of night. In some cultures, people even believed that forcing sleep was unwise. They thought sleep had its own intelligence, arriving when the body was ready. So instead of frustration, there was patience; instead of struggle, there was waiting. Even more unexpected were the quiet behaviors people developed when lying awake. Some would slowly trace patterns in dust or fabric, others would rehearse conversations in their minds, not out of stress alone, but as a way to gently occupy thoughts until they softened. A few would simply lie still and focus on breathing. Long before breathing techniques were ever formally described, not as a practice, but as instinct, perhaps the most surprising habit of all, however, was acceptance. Not every sleepless night was treated as a problem to solve. Sometimes it was simply experienced. People would watch shadows move across walls and accept that wakefulness was part of the human cycle, not a failure. Not an illness, just a passing state, and in that acceptance, something shifted. The night felt less like an enemy, and more like a space to exist within. Meanwhile, beyond homes and villages, others remained awake for reasons entirely different. Some watched over animals, some guarded roads and city gates, some worked through the night so others could rest safely. Their habits were not gentle or reflective, but practical, and yet, they too developed rhythms of their own, because across all ancient worlds, whether in silence or labor, the night shaped everyone who lived beneath it. And as we move forward, away from these quiet discoveries, we begin to see something even more striking. That ancient sleeplessness was not rare at all. It was ordinary, shared, and deeply human. But what happens when sleeplessness is not peaceful at all? What happens when it belongs not to comfort or reflection, but to responsibility, to work that cannot pause with the sun? That is where our journey turns next. And so, as we leave behind the quiet rhythms of night workers and wandering travelers, the journey takes us deeper into something more intimate, not a place, not a civilization, but a pattern of sleep itself, because across many ancient societies, sleep was not always the long, uninterrupted stretch we imagine today. Instead, the night often came in two parts: a first sleep, a waking period, and then a second sleep. This idea, known today as segmented sleep, quietly appears in historical records, letters, and old medical writings from different parts of the ancient world, and for the people who lived it, it was not unusual at all. It was simply night. After sunset, people would go to bed earlier than we do today. The first sleep would settle in naturally, carried by exhaustion from the day. Homes would fall silent, fires would dim, the world would soften into darkness. But then, somewhere deep in the night, people would wake, not in panic, not in confusion, but in a calm, familiar state of awareness. They would lie still for a moment, adjusting to the silence around them, and instead of immediately trying to return to sleep, many would use this time in different ways. Some would simply remain in bed, half dreaming, thinking gently about the day that had passed. Others would sit up and reflect quietly in the dark. In rural homes, a person might step outside briefly, noticing how the night felt different during this hidden hour. The air was colder, the sky felt deeper, and the world seemed suspended, as if holding its breath. In some households, this was a time for small, quiet tasks, tending to a fire, checking on animals, adjusting blankets or bedding. Nothing urgent, nothing demanding. Just the soft maintenance of life. In cities like Rome, writers and physicians even mentioned this nighttime waking as something ordinary. They described it almost casually, as though everyone understood it already. Letters from centuries ago hint that people sometimes used this time for reading, prayer, or conversation with someone nearby, a shared moment of stillness in the middle of darkness. And then, after a while, sleep would return, not forced, not chased, but arriving again. Naturally, like a tide slowly rising back to shore. This second sleep often felt lighter, more dream-filled, more fragile, and when morning finally came, many people did not question the structure of their night. Because it matched the rhythm of their lives, shorter periods of intense activity during the day, longer, quieter stretches of rest during the night, there was no expectation that sleep should be continuous. That idea, so familiar to us now, became more common only much later in human history, as cities grew brighter, as work schedules tightened, as artificial light extended the day beyond natural limits. But in the ancient world, night was still large, slow, uninterrupted by urgency, and so sleep moved with it. Yet not everyone experienced this pattern in the same way. For some, waking in the night was peaceful. For others, it brought questions, thoughts that surfaced only in darkness. Memories that returned without warning, moments of reflection that felt too heavy for daylight. And so, even within this shared rhythm, each person's experience remained deeply personal, a quiet conversation between body, mind, and night itself. What is most striking is not just that people woke in the night, but that they accepted it. They did not see it as broken sleep. They did not label it as a problem. It was simply part of being human. And perhaps there is something almost comforting in that, a reminder that sleep has never been as fixed as we imagine. It has always shifted with time, culture, and way of life. Even the night, something we think of as constant, has always been experienced differently depending on who is lying awake beneath it. And as this realization settles, we begin to notice something else, because if waking in the night was once normal, then the question is not just how people slept, but how they lived during those hours in between, when darkness was not the end of sleep, but a pause within it, and that pause, in the centuries that followed, would slowly begin to disappear. And so, as the quiet rhythm of segmented sleep slowly fades behind us, the world begins to change once again. The air feels different here, heavier, colder, and the night, once soft and familiar in the ancient world, now carries a deeper silence. We have entered the Middle Ages, a time when darkness seemed longer, and nights often felt more demanding than before. In small villages scattered across fields and forests, people still went to bed soon after sunset. The day's work was exhausting, plowing land, tending animals, carrying water, repairing homes built from stone and timber. So when night arrived, sleep usually came quickly, but not always peacefully, because medieval nights were shaped by uncertainty. The wind outside often sounded louder in wooden homes, rain against thatched roofs felt closer, more immediate, and the absence of light made every sound feel more meaningful. For those who remained awake, the night had a different character than in earlier times. Fireplaces became the center of life, a small flame in a large world of shadow. Families would gather close, not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Even when sleep refused to come, people rarely sat alone. Silence was shared, and that sharing made it easier to endure. In many households, prayer became a natural companion to sleeplessness. Not always formal prayer, sometimes just quiet words spoken inwardly, a repetition of familiar phrases learned in childhood, a way of calming the mind when thoughts became too active in the dark. Monasteries, too, shaped the medieval night in unique ways. Monks followed strict schedules of prayer throughout the hours of darkness, waking at set times. They moved through stone corridors illuminated by candles. Their footsteps echoed softly in vast halls. For them, night was not empty. It was structured, a rhythm of devotion that continued until dawn. But for ordinary people outside monastery walls, the night was less predictable. A sleepless farmer might sit near dying embers, watching sparks rise and disappear into darkness. A mother might remain awake beside a child, listening to the rhythm of their breathing. A traveler might rest in a roadside shelter, alert to distant sounds carried through the cold air. sleep was always close, but not guaranteed. There were also beliefs that shaped how people experienced wakefulness. Many thought the night carried spiritual weight, that dreams and thoughts during these hours might hold meaning beyond ordinary life. Some believed that wandering spirits were more active in darkness. Others thought protection came from simple objects placed near beds, small crosses, charms, written prayers. These were not always acts of fear, but of reassurance, because medieval life was often uncertain, and the night amplified that uncertainty. Yet even in this atmosphere, people adapted. They learned to live with darkness instead of resisting it. Some households kept simple tasks for sleepless hours: mending cloth, sharpening tools, preparing items for the next day, not as productivity in the modern sense, but as a way to stay grounded. Others simply sat and listened, to wind outside, to distant animals, to the soft settling of wood as homes cooled through the night, and slowly, without forcing it, sleep would often return. What is most striking about medieval nights is not their hardship, but their familiarity. People were not surprised by sleeplessness. It was part of life's rhythm. A night might be long, or broken into segments, or filled with brief moments of wakefulness, but it was always accepted as something natural, and in that acceptance, there was a quiet resilience, a sense that even darkness had its place in the structure of living, as centuries moved forward. However, something subtle began to shift. Cities slowly grew brighter, trade increased movement at all hours, and the boundaries between day and night began to blur. But in the medieval world, those boundaries were still strong, clear, unbroken, and as we leave this era behind, we begin to step toward another kind of life entirely, one shaped not only by tradition, but by movement, labor, and the endless demands of working through the night. And so, as the last lights of medieval villages fade into the distance, the world opens up again, this time not into palaces or monasteries, but into open land, endless fields stretching beneath a vast, indifferent sky. Here, far from stone cities and structured prayers, life followed a simpler and harsher rhythm, the life of farmers. For them, night was not always rest. Sometimes, it was continuation, because the land never fully paused. Animals still needed care, weather still changed without warning, and the earth itself demanded attention even after sunset. In many rural communities, sleepless nights were not unusual during certain seasons: harvest time and lambing season, periods of rain or drought, times when survival depended on constant awareness. A farmer awake at night might walk slowly through fields, checking the condition of crops under pale moonlight. The soil looked different at night, softer, less defined, almost like a living surface shifting under the sky. In barns, the sounds of animals created a steady background rhythm: cows shifting weight, sheep moving gently in their pens, chickens settling into stillness only to stir again in response to distant noise. These sounds were not disturbing, they were familiar, they were life continuing. Inside small wooden homes nearby, families often remained close to the fire even when sleep was delayed. Not always speaking, sometimes simply sitting together in silence, listening to the wind move across fields outside, a wind that carried both comfort and uncertainty, because farmers understood something deeply intuitive: the night could change everything. A sudden storm could undo weeks of work, a cold snap could damage fragile crops. So even in sleeplessness, there was a sense of watchfulness, not fear exactly, but readiness. Some farmers used these quiet hours for preparation, repairing broken tools by lantern light, sharpening blades, mending ropes or baskets, simple tasks that did not require full attention but kept the hand steady and the mind anchored. Others would step outside and simply observe, The sky above rural lands was enormous. Uninterrupted by walls or towers, stars appeared sharper here than anywhere else, and for someone tired but awake, that sky could become strangely calming, a reminder that life was larger than immediate worries. In some villages, night watch duties were shared among families, not formal in structure, but naturally understood. If one household stayed awake, others felt safer sleeping. If a dog barked in the distance, someone would rise to check the surroundings. It was a quiet system of mutual awareness, built not from rules, but from necessity. There were also moments of stillness that came unexpectedly. A farmer standing alone in a field at night might suddenly feel the weight of silence. No voices, no movement, only wind passing through tall grass. In those moments, thoughts often softened. Concerns about work did not disappear, but they became less sharp, more distant, as if the night itself absorbed some of their weight. And then there were moments of exhaustion that arrived without warning. A person sitting near a fire might simply lean back and close their eyes for a brief rest, not planned sleep, just surrender. And sometimes that brief surrender became real sleep, even if only for a short while. What is striking about farmers' nights is how closely they were tied to nature. Unlike city dwellers, they did not experience night as a separate world. They lived inside it. Wind, soil, animals, weather, all continued without pause, and so did they, not always by choice, but by rhythm. Even sleeplessness, in this setting, felt less like interruption and more like participation, a reminder that life itself did not follow strict divisions between day and night. It flowed, shifted, adapted, and in that constant movement, farmers learned endurance in its most natural form, not through philosophy, not through ritual, but through repetition of living itself. As centuries moved forward, however, this connection between night and land would slowly begin to change. Cities would grow larger, work would become less tied to seasons, and artificial light would begin to reshape the meaning of darkness. But here, in these fields, under these stars, night still belonged to the earth, and to those who worked upon it. Yet beyond the fields, in places far from soil and harvest, another group of people experienced sleepless nights in a very different way, not through nature, but through movement, through travel, and through journeys that never truly paused for darkness. And so, as the fields fade into the distance and the wind over the crops grows quieter in memory, we begin to drift away from the outer world, away from soil, fire, and stone, and toward something far more fragile, the inner world of sleep. Because for ancient people, sleep was never just rest. It was a passage, a crossing point between what could be seen and what could only be experienced, and at the center of that passage were dreams. Across civilizations, dreams were treated with a kind of quiet seriousness, not always fear, not always wonder, but attention. In ancient Egypt, dreams were believed to carry messages from gods or hidden truths from beyond ordinary perception. A person might wake in the middle of the night still holding the feeling of a dream, unsure whether it was memory or warning, and so they would remain still for a moment, trying to understand it before it faded. Some even kept simple dream interpretations, passed down through generations like family knowledge. In Mesopotamia, dreams were often recorded on clay tablets. Certain dreams were thought to reflect divine communication, especially if they appeared vivid or repeated. Priests and scholars would sometimes be consulted, not to predict the future in a dramatic sense, but to understand what the dream might be pointing toward in daily life. In Greece, dreams moved closer to philosophy. Thinkers wondered whether dreams were reflections of the mind itself, or glimpses of something greater, a hidden layer of reality that only appeared when the body was still. For a sleepless person in any of these worlds, dreams became a strange point of curiosity, because when sleep finally arrived after long wakefulness, it often felt deeper, more intense, almost like falling through layers of thought. Some people believed that dreams were shaped by what happened before sleep, the sounds heard during the night, the emotions carried from the day, even the position of the body resting on a mat or bed. So, those who struggled with sleeplessness sometimes viewed their wakeful thoughts as part of dream formation, as if the mind continued its work even without rest. There were also beliefs about protective forces during sleep. Many cultures thought the soul traveled during dreams, not physically leaving the body in a literal sense, but entering a space where distance and time behave differently. Because of this, people often sought safety in small ways before sleeping: a familiar object placed near the head, a short prayer whispered into darkness, a sense of grounding before letting go of awareness. Yet not all dreams were welcomed. Nightmares were also recognized across ancient societies. But they were not always seen as purely psychological. Sometimes they were interpreted as warnings, or disturbances in balance, or simply unexplained experiences that belong to the mysterious side of night. And still, people accepted them as part of life, because dreams, like sleeplessness, could not be controlled. They arrived without permission and disappeared without explanation. What is most remarkable is how closely dreams and sleeplessness were connected in ancient thought. Both belong to the same threshold, that uncertain space between waking and sleeping, where thought softened, where reality blurred slightly, where the mind was no longer fully anchored to the physical world. A person lying awake for hours might drift into brief dreamlike states without fully realizing it. Short fragments of imagery, moments of imagination that felt almost real. Ancient people noticed these transitions carefully. They did not separate mind states as rigidly as we often do today. Wakefulness, sleep, dreaming, they existed on a continuum, a flowing movement rather than fixed categories. And perhaps that is why nights felt so meaningful, because even in sleeplessness, the mind was never idle. It was always moving, always creating, always reaching toward rest in its own way. As centuries continued, these beliefs would slowly evolve. Philosophers would question them, religions would reshape them, and later, science would attempt to explain them in entirely new language. But in the ancient world, dreams remained something softer, less defined, more personal, and deeply tied to the quiet hours of night. Yet even as people looked inward toward dreams, they also looked outward toward the world around them. And there, another element of night shaped every sleepless hour: light, or rather, the absence of it. And so, as dreams begin to fade back into the quiet folds of memory, we return once more to the physical world, to something simple, something ancient, something that shaped nearly every sleepless night in human history: light, or more precisely, the fragile presence of fire after sunset. In the ancient world, night was never fully dark in the way we imagine today, but it was close enough to feel vast, uncontrolled, and deeply alive. In its stillness, a single flame could change everything. Inside homes built of stone, clay, or timber, fire was more than warmth. It was orientation. It gave the room shape, it gave shadows meaning, and it gave the mind something to hold onto when sleep refused to come. A small oil lamp placed in a corner of a room created a world within darkness. Its glow did not reach far, but it reached enough to soften the edges of furniture, enough to turn silence into something visible, enough to make a sleepless person feel less alone. For many ancient households, the fire was never allowed to go completely out during the night, not only for comfort, but for survival. It protected against cold, it kept animals at bay, and it allowed people to see if they needed to move quickly in an emergency. But beyond practicality, fire carried something more emotional. It felt alive, it flickered, it shifted, it responded to breath, wind, and movement. And so, for someone lying awake in the dark, watching a flame could become a kind of meditation. In Egypt, oil lamps made from clay or stone were carefully filled and adjusted so the flame burned steadily. The light reflected softly on painted walls and carved objects, turning familiar spaces into quiet landscapes of shadow and gold. In Rome, lamps were often placed in corridors and courtyards, guiding movement even during the deepest hours of night. A sleepless person walking through a villa would move from one circle of light to another, as if passing through small islands in an ocean of darkness. In Greece, fire was often central to the home. Families gathered around it not only for warmth but for connection. Even when conversation faded, the glow remained, marking time in a gentle, irregular rhythm. And in rural communities across all civilizations, the fire was often the last companion of the night. A farmer might sit beside it long after others had fallen asleep, watching embers shift from bright orange to deep red, then slowly into ash, each stage of the fire reflecting the passage of time itself. There is something deeply calming about watching flame. It does not move with intention, it does not demand attention. And yet it holds it, a sleepless mind, often filled with wandering thoughts, finds a strange focus in its unpredictability. The flame becomes a point where thoughts can slow down, where breathing becomes easier to notice, where time stops feeling sharp. Candlelight and oil lamps also shaped perception. They softened everything they touched. Walls became warmer, objects less defined, even faces appeared calmer in the glow. Perhaps that is why so many ancient people preferred low light during sleepless hours. Not because they avoided brightness, but because they trusted softness more. Outside the circle of firelight, however, darkness remained vast, and that contrast was important. It reminded people that safety existed within boundaries, that light marked the difference between known and unknown, between inside and outside, between rest and restlessness. And yet, as the night grew deeper, even fire began to change. Lamps burned lower, wicks shortened, oil thinned, and slowly, light itself became part of the night's fading rhythm, a signal that wakefulness too was beginning to soften. Eventually, even the most persistent flame would surrender, leaving only embers, then darkness. And in that final transition, sleep often arrived quietly, not as an interruption, but as a natural continuation of diminishing light, as if the body, like the fire, simply learned when to let go. But not every night followed this gentle pattern, because beyond homes and hearths, there were places where fire was not comfort, but duty, where light was not for rest, but for vigilance, and in those places, night took on an entirely different meaning. And so, as the last embers of firelight fade into memory, and the soft glow of oil lamps begins to feel distant, we arrive at something quieter still, something deeply human, something shared across nearly every ancient civilization: food and drink in the night. Because when sleep refused to come, many people turned not only to silence or thought, but to simple nourishment. Not feasts, not celebration, just small, quiet moments of comfort taken in the dark. In the ancient world, nighttime eating was never loud or excessive. It was gentle, almost hesitant. A person waking in the middle of the night might drink a little water from a clay cup, feeling the coolness settle their thoughts. Another might warm a small portion of grain porridge left from earlier in the day. Nothing freshly prepared, nothing elaborate, just enough to steady the body. In Egypt, light meals before or during the night were often paired with dates, bread, or figures, foods that were easy to digest, soft in texture, and naturally sweet. A sleepless person might sit quietly near a window, slowly eating under the faint glow of a lamp, listening to the Nile's distant presence outside. In Mesopotamia, Barley-based drinks and simple broths were common. Warm liquids were believed to calm both body and spirit. The act of drinking something warm in the night was not just physical, it was emotional. A signal of safety, of pause, of slowing down. In Greece, honey mixed with water or wine was sometimes consumed in small amounts during the evening hours. Not for indulgence, but for balance, the Greeks believed in moderation, and even nighttime nourishment followed that idea: light, measured, unhurried. In Rome, wealthier households often kept kitchens partially active late into the evening, not for grand meals, but for preparation of simple comforts. Warm milk, softened bread, or diluted wine might be offered to someone who could not sleep, and in poorer households, the options were simpler still. Whatever remained from the day, a piece of bread, a handful of olives, a few nuts stored in clay jars. Yet across all these differences, something remained constant: the night softened appetite. People did not seek fullness. They sought ease, and food became less about hunger, and more about settling the mind. Even drinking water took on meaning in sleepless hours. A slow sip in darkness could feel grounding, a reminder of the body, of presence, of being here, in this moment, rather than lost in thought. Some ancient medical traditions even suggested certain foods for calming the body before sleep. Warm milk was mentioned in later writings, so were herbs mixed into drinks. Not always effective by modern understanding, but deeply trusted in their time, because belief itself often shaped experience. There were also quiet rituals around preparing these foods: a pot gently placed near embers to warm, a bowl carefully stirred in dim light, the soft sound of movement in a sleeping house. These actions created rhythm, and rhythm, in sleepless nights, becomes a form of comfort. Outside, the world remained still. Fields, cities, and rivers continued under the same stars, but inside small homes, the act of eating or drinking something simple created a bridge between wakefulness and rest. A moment where the body was cared for without urgency, and perhaps that is what made these nighttime habits so important: not their nutritional value, but their emotional weight. They reminded people that even in darkness, life continued gently. Not everything required effort, not every moment needed resolution. Sometimes, a sip of water was enough, sometimes, a piece of bread was enough, and sometimes, simply sitting with something warm in your hands was enough to carry the night forward. Yet food and drink were only part of how people endured sleepless hours, because beyond the body, beyond warmth and taste, there were those who remained awake for entirely different reasons: not comfort, not reflection, but responsibility, work that could not pause with the sun, and watchfulness that shaped the edge of every ancient night. And so, as quiet meals fade into memory and the soft warmth of nighttime comfort slowly dissolves into darkness, we arrive at a different kind of night, a night that does not belong to rest, but to responsibility, because while many ancient people learned to move gently through sleepless hours, there were others who never had the option of waiting for morning. Their lives unfolded entirely in the dark: guardians, workers, watchmen, messengers, and laborers whose world began when the sun disappeared. In ancient cities, the night was never truly empty. Even when streets grew quiet, movement continued in subtle ways. Torches flickered along stone roads, doors opened softly for those who needed to pass, and footsteps echoed in places where silence was expected. City guards were among the most familiar figures of the night. They walked slowly along walls, towers, and gates, not in haste, but in steady rhythm. Their presence was not only for protection, but for reassurance, a reminder that even in darkness, order remained. In Rome, night watchmen patrolled streets that had grown still after the noise of the day. Their lamps cast small pools of light on empty roads. Every shadow had To be observed, every sound had to be noticed, yet most nights passed without incident, only wind, only distant movement, only the city breathing in its sleep. In Egypt, guards watched over temples and storage areas where grain and sacred objects were kept. The silence of these spaces felt different, heavier, almost sacred, and so, even the act of guarding became a quiet ritual of patience. In rural regions, shepherds often became night workers without formal titles. They stayed awake beside flocks under open skies, listening for signs of danger. A sudden movement in the dark, a distant sound in the fields, the soft tension of responsibility resting on tired shoulders. Messengers also traveled through night when urgency demanded it, carrying news between settlements, moving along roads lit only by stars and occasional torches. Their journeys were long and uncertain, but necessary, because communication could not always wait for daylight, and then there were laborious, in some places. Work continued through the night during certain seasons, grinding grain, tending furnaces, maintaining essential tasks that supported entire communities. These workers experienced night not as silence, but as continuation, a different version of day. Yet even among those who worked, the night had its own rhythm, slower, quieter, more internal. There were moments of stillness even in labor, a pause between tasks, a brief rest beside a wall or fire, a moment to breathe while the world remained half asleep, and in those pauses, the night revealed something subtle, that even responsibility cannot fully erase human reflection. A guard standing alone might look up at the sky and notice how vast it was. A worker might pause and feel the weight of exhaustion soften into acceptance. A traveler might stop for a moment and listen to the silence between distant winds. Even in duty, humanity remained present, not entirely absorbed by work, not entirely separate from thought. There was also a shared understanding among night workers. They were few, but not alone in experience. Across different lands and cultures, others were awake at the same time, doing similar tasks, holding similar thoughts, connected only by the quiet fact of shared wakefulness, and perhaps that created a subtle bond, even if never spoken, because while most of the world slept, those who remained awake experienced something unique. A world without crowds, without noise, without distraction, only presence, only task, only time passing slowly through darkness. Yet as the night deepened, even these workers would eventually feel the pull of rest. When their duties allowed, they would return to simple places of sleep, to mats, to corners of shelters, to quiet spaces near fading fires, and sleep, when it came, often arrived quickly, not because the night was easy, but because exhaustion finally met stillness. As we move forward from these unseen hours of labor, we begin to notice something larger forming beneath the surface of all these lives. Farmers, thinkers, travelers, dreamers, workers, all moving through the same darkness in different ways. And yet, the night itself remained unchanged, patient, unmoving, observing everything without judgment. But soon, even this ancient rhythm would begin to shift, because humanity was slowly learning to move through the world in ways that would eventually blur the boundary between day and night altogether. And so, as the last torchlight of night workers fades into the distance, the world begins to open again, not into homes, not into fields, but into roads, endless paths stretching through mountains, deserts, forests, and coastlines, because in the ancient world, travel did not pause when the sun disappeared. If anything, night often became part of the journey. Travelers moved through darkness for many reasons: to avoid daytime heat, to reach distant towns faster, to follow the safest timing for long routes between cities, and sometimes, simply because there was no other choice. A road in the ancient night was a very different place from what it had been during the day. familiar landmarks disappeared. Colors vanished, only shape and shadow remained, and so travelers learned to rely on senses other than sight. The sound of footsteps on stone or dirt, the distant movement of animals in fields, the faint glow of stars guiding direction overhead. For someone experiencing sleeplessness on a journey, the night did not feel like a pause. It felt like motion continuing through exhaustion. Caravans moved slowly across deserts, guided by experienced travelers who knew how to read the sky. Camels walked in steady rhythm, their silhouettes barely visible against the horizon. Men and women wrapped themselves in cloaks, protecting against cold winds that arrived only after sunset. Conversation was minimal, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence made the journey easier. In ancient Greece, sailors sometimes traveled at night when seas were calm. They watched constellations carefully, using them as guides across vast waters. The ocean at night was both peaceful and unsettling, a surface of moving darkness beneath an infinite sky. For sailors, sleeplessness often came not from discomfort, but from responsibility. They had to remain alert, to watch sails, to listen to wind, to observe subtle changes in the water. In Rome, roads connecting cities were used by official messengers and traders who often traveled during late hours. Rest stops existed, but journeys were long, and urgency sometimes required continuous movement. A traveler walking through such nights might experience moments of deep quiet, so quiet that even thought seemed to slow. Only the rhythm of walking remained, step after step, breath after breath. In Egypt, travel along the Nile sometimes continued after sunset. Boats drifted under moonlight, guided by stars and the gentle current of the river. Water reflected the sky so clearly that it became difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. For a sleepless traveler on such a journey, the experience could feel almost unreal, as if moving through a space between worlds. There were also moments of pause during travel, not full rest, but brief halts along the way, a fire lit in a temporary shelter, a shared meal between strangers, a short silence before continuing forward. These pauses became essential, not just for physical recovery, but for mental grounding. Because long journeys in darkness could blur time, hours felt uncertain, distances felt longer, and the mind, left alone with movement and silence, often drifted into reflection. Travelers thought about home, about where they had come from, about where they were going, and sometimes about nothing at all, simply watching the night pass. In many cultures, travel itself became symbolic of life, a path through uncertainty, a movement toward something unseen, and sleeplessness during travel felt like part of that symbolism, a reminder that not all journeys are meant for comfort, some are meant for endurance. Yet even in hardship, there was beauty, the beauty of stars that never changed their position, the beauty of distant lights appearing on horizons, the beauty of finally arriving at a destination when dawn slowly returned. And then, at last, sleep would come, often not in perfect conditions, but in relief, in completion, in the simple fact that movement had ended. As we leave behind these wandering figures, the night begins to feel different again, because we are now approaching the edge of something more reflective, a moment where ancient habits begin to speak to modern life, and where the past quietly meets the present. And so, as the long roads of ancient travelers fade into memory, and the last campfires dissolve into the silence of distant horizons, we arrive somewhere closer, not in time, but in understanding, because the nights of the ancient world, though far removed from ours, still echo in subtle ways through modern sleeplessness. The problems have not changed as much as we might think, only the environment around them has. Ancient people knew what it meant to lie awake in darkness. They knew the quiet pressure of thoughts that refused to settle, They knew the long stretch of time between waking and morning, but instead of fighting the night, many of them moved with it, not always intentionally, but naturally, through habit and necessity, and there is something in that approach that still feels relevant today. One of the most striking differences lies in how time was experienced. Without glowing clocks or constant artificial light, ancient nights had no urgency. A sleepless hour was just an hour, not a problem to solve, not a delay to fix, simply time passing in its own rhythm. Modern life, in contrast, often turns wakefulness into pressure, a race against the next day, a countdown that begins the moment sleep fails to arrive. But in ancient settings, that pressure rarely existed in the same way. Night was simply longer, slower, less defined. Another quiet lesson comes from how ancient people treated wakefulness itself. They did not always force sleep immediately. Instead, they shifted their behavior. They adjusted lighting. They sat quietly. They drank something warm. They listened to the environment. Or they simply remained still until sleep returned on its own terms. There was less struggle, more acceptance, and that acceptance softened the experience of sleeplessness. Even segmented sleep, once common across many regions, reveals something important. Waking in the night was not seen as failure. It was part of a natural cycle, a pause within rest, not a disruption of it. And while modern sleep science describes different structures and recommendations, the emotional response of ancient people often remained calm, unburdened by labels, unburdened by expectation. Another subtle difference lies in the role of light. Ancient nights were shaped by firelight and oil lamps that could not erase darkness completely. So people lived within soft illumination, not full brightness, not total darkness, but something in between. That middle space seemed to encourage slower thoughts, gentler pacing, less stimulation. Modern environments, filled with artificial light and constant stimulation, rarely offer that balance, and yet, when people today recreate softer nighttime conditions, many report a similar sense of calm. Ancient habits also remind us of the importance of small, repetitive actions. Pouring water, adjusting bedding, walking slowly, watching a flame, these were not solutions, they were transitions, ways of moving through wakefulness without resistance. Perhaps the most meaningful lesson, however, is psychological rather than practical. Ancient people did not treat sleeplessness as something unnatural. It was part of life, not ideal, not permanent, but normal, and that normalization changed the emotional weight of the experience, because often, what keeps us awake is not only the absence of sleep, but the stress placed upon that absence. Of course, ancient life was not peaceful in a modern sense. It carried its own hardships, uncertainties, and physical demands, but within those limitations, people developed a different relationship with night, less expectation, less control, more coexistence. And as we observe that contrast from a modern perspective, something becomes clear. Sleep has never been entirely within human control. It arrives, it retreats, it follows patterns shaped by environment, culture, and time. Even today, despite all our knowledge and technology, it still retains that unpredictability, and perhaps that is the final quiet lesson from the ancient world, that sleeplessness is not an exception to life, it is part of it, a space between rest and return, a reminder that even in darkness, time continues gently forward. And as we move into the final part of this journey, we begin to see how all these ancient nights, farmers, travelers, thinkers, workers, slowly come together into one shared understanding, that the night was never truly separate from human life, it was always part of it, and still is. And so, after all the wandering roads, flickering fires, sleepless fields, and silent corridors of thought, we arrive at the final stretch of the night, the moment when everything begins to soften, not suddenly, but slowly, like breath easing after a long day that no one fully remembers beginning. In the ancient world, this was the hour few people ever described in detail, because it did not feel important at the time. It was not dramatic, not unusual. It was simply the final phase of darkness before morning returned. Yet, if you were awake during this time, you would notice something subtle in the air. The world felt slightly different, still, not empty, but settled. Even the sounds of night seemed to lose their edge. The wind moved more gently through trees and streets, animals grew quieter, fires burned lower, becoming soft red glows rather than bright flames. Inside homes, people who had been awake through long hours often found themselves no longer resisting sleep, not because they tried harder, but because everything around them seemed to agree that rest was near. A farmer resting near a dying hearth might no longer think about the work of the next day. A traveler lying beneath open skies might stop counting stars. A guard leaning against a stone wall might let his awareness drift in and out without notice, and in those small dissolving moments of alertness, sleep would arrive, not as a decision, but a surrender. Across cities, villages, deserts, and rivers, the same quiet transformation unfolded. Lamps dimmed for the last time, candles finally gave into their wax, fires collapsed into embers that barely glowed, and darkness returned to its full shape. But this darkness was no longer active. It was complete, whole, the kind of darkness that no longer feels like something happening, but something simply being. In that stillness, ancient people crossed the final threshold between wakefulness and rest. Some slowly, some instantly, some without even realizing the moment it happened, and as sleep deepened across the world, the divisions of human life began to dissolve. Farmers, philosophers, travelers, workers, nobles, monks, all reduced to the same quiet state, breathing, resting, dreaming. The night no longer belonged to roles or responsibilities. It belonged to the body, to time, to silence, and then, somewhere beyond perception, the first hint of change would begin, not loud, not sudden, but delicate, a shift in the color of darkness, a faint easing of the sky, a suggestion that the world was about to move again. Morning, in the ancient world, did not arrive like a sharp interruption. It arrived like patience finally reaching its end, and when it did, everything that had been suspended through the night slowly returned: sound, movement, purpose. But for a brief moment before that return, there was always this final space, this shared stillness, where the entire ancient world, without knowing it, rested together under the same sky. And perhaps that is the quiet truth behind all these sleepless nights we have traveled through. They were never truly separate stories. They were variations of the same experience, human beings, across time and place, trying to find rest in darkness. Sometimes easily, sometimes not at all. And sometimes learning, without ever naming it, that wakefulness itself was part of being alive. So as this journey comes to an end, the night does not feel like something distant anymore. It feels familiar, like something remembered rather than studied. And as the first light of dawn finally touches the edges of the world, the ancient night quietly lets go.